With OTAs underway at the VMAC, it's only a matter of time until the Seahawks are initializing their first 53-man roster. So Dallas Cooper and I are going to dish out our first projections here on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined on our Wednesday episode by my co-host, Dallas Cooper. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there, whether you're listening in Rhode Island or you're overseas listening in Britain. We greatly appreciate you taking the time to listen to Locked On Seahawks. We are going to be initiating our first 53-man roster projection of the 2023 season today. One of my favorite episodes, the first chance to really look at how this roster is taking shape. I know that OTAs just started, but Dallas, this is an interesting time because really this is the 90-man roster for the most part that is going to be going to training camp. There's going to be a few moves that are made here and there as they shuffle the back end of the roster, but I wouldn't expect any other significant moves. And so with that being said, it gives us a really good chance to see what this roster is going to look like. And we're going to make it a little bit like March Madness, even though it's May, with our last three in, first three out, and next three out. That's how we're going to open the show, and then we'll be breaking down our depth charts on offense and defense and see where you and I are similar and where we differ with our thoughts on how this roster is going to be constructed. So let's get to the really fun part, the elimination process, because let's face it, Dallas, guys like Geno Smith and Ken Walker III, Bobby Wagner, players like that, we know that they are going to be on the 53-man roster. There's not going to be any ifs or buts about that. So a lot of these spots have already been taken, but this year is unique in the sense you have so many rookies and so many open roster spots with all the turnover they've had that I do think that that back part of the roster is going to be a fascinating study here to see where the Seahawks turn. And so I actually had some pretty tough decisions here. Let's get to our last three in. These are the last three players that made your roster. Dallas, who were those last three that you selected?
Well, I'm going to start off with Tyreek Smith, the edge out of Ohio State that was drafted last season. Got Matt Landers, the wide receiver from Arkansas, and Jonah Tavai, nose tackle out of San Diego State. All three of these players are just young players. Tyreek Smith drafted last year. Landers and Tavai, both rookies coming in this year. And they've both been showing out at OTAs, showing promise. Specifically, Landers, the question's been, how is he going to make the roster with a lot of this much receivers? My question is, I don't see how he doesn't make the roster. So physically gifted, brings the talent. I think this is exactly the kind of guy that Seahawks can take a chance on.
Yeah, I was in similar vein with you on two of these selections. Tyreek Smith was one of my last three in, as was Jonah Tavai. I just think Tavai's pass rushing upside, and we'll have more time to elaborate on his pass rushing upside, chance to make an impact for the Seahawks as an undrafted rookie. And Forrest Merrill, I don't know why I put Foster on here, but Forrest Merrill from the Chargers originally, a Western Kentucky guy. He's a 330-plus pound nose tackle. Seattle just doesn't have very many guys like that on the roster. He has played in a few regular season games. That's where Seattle's at that nose tackle position. I think they need to have somebody with Brian Monet likely to miss extensive time recovering from his ACL. They need somebody else big body that can rotate in with Cameron Young there. Jonah Tavai is a player that can play some nose, but he's not big enough to be an early down guy there. So I think Merrill has a chance, at least early in the season, to be on the Seahawks roster. And so he was one of the last three that I had in. Now, let's get to the first three that were out, the players that just missed the bubble. And you and I had a little bit different opinion on this one.
Yes, this was one that we differentiated, but my first three out has got to be Alton Robinson, John Radigan, and Forrest Merrill. And this is, again, especially with Alton Robinson, nothing to do with the talent of the player. It's just a position that there's a lot of bodies at, and the Seahawks have taken a lot of recent draft capital in order to address that position. Therefore, there's always going to be an odd man out, and therefore, I feel for the edge position specifically, Alton Robinson is going to be that guy, unfortunately. John Radigan at linebacker. Personally, I think the Seahawks are going to take a chance on Vi Jones and let him make the roster. More athleticism. He's a little younger. I think, especially with Bobby Wagner coming back, being able to mentor this linebacking group, those are the guys you want to take chances on and see if Bobby can get to them. The coaching staff is going to be able to get to them and fully maximize their potential. And Forrest Merrill, I know we were talking about the Seahawks are lacking those 330-pound nose tackles, Corbin. As you said it perfectly with that. And Monet is the only other one currently on the roster with the loss of Al Woods this offseason. However, I feel that Pete Carroll's really wanting to go with a speedier nose and not traditional two-gapping from the A-gap. I think he wants them to lag behind or play one side of the A-gap and just penetrate and cause chaos. And Tavai can definitely do that. That's why I think both of us had him on our roster making the team.
Yeah, that's going to be a fascinating one just because we don't know if they're done adding at that position. That might be a spot, and we'll have more time to talk about that later in the show, but that might be a spot that they are really monitoring training camp cuts to see who ends up hitting the market. As for me, I did agree with you on Alton Robinson, and that was tough because it really was Robinson or Smith. I can't see both of them making the team with Derek Hall now being drafted in the second round. You have Boye Mafe and all the other talent that they have there. Cade Johnson is number 2 for me. I have him ahead of Landers just because we saw what he did last year late in the season, the performance that he had against the Rams in Week 17, and he's a guy that the organization holds in really high regard. If he can find a way to make a little bit more of a contribution on special teams, he might be a sneaky wild card to watch to make this team as a 6th receiver. And I had Vi Jones on the outside looking in instead of John Radigan, just because I feel like Radigan is a more polished linebacker at this point. But Vi Jones, I think, has a higher ceiling. He's a better athlete, a really good special teams player. You can say that for both these guys. They're different style special teams players, but that one is going to be another one that's going to truly be just kind of, pick which strength that you want, because I think both of them are good enough to be on an NFL roster. But in this case, I just think Radigan, now more than a year removed from his knee injury, he's going to be ready to go. The Seahawks hold him in high regard as well. So those 3, unfortunately, are just on the outside looking in. And then just as they do in the NCAA tournament, you've got your next 3 out, 3 other players that were on the precipice but not able to make the team. And let's get those 3 players that were just on that periphery that weren't quite able to make your roster.
So for me, I'm going to start off with the quarterback from East Carolina, Holton Ahlers, Joey Hunt, the center, and James Campbell, rookie cornerback from Montana State. And Holton Ahlers, for me, again, not an issue of talent. He's shown it throughout his college career, played 55 games, led his school record in passing yards, total yards, touchdowns, completions, pass attempts, rushing touchdowns by a quarterback. He did it all. Yet there's Geno at quarterback, and the Seahawks this season signed Drew Lock to a little bit heftier of a contract than traditional for backup quarterbacks. Therefore, I can't see them making the decision to take Ahlers on as the backup and then cutting Drew Lock. I don't see that happening. Therefore, I think the 2 people at quarterback going to go into the roster is going to be Geno Smith and Drew Lock. Joey Hunt, again, Oluwatimi is coming in as a rookie. You signed in Evan Brown this past offseason. There's going to be an odd man out. And I think, unfortunately, it's going to be Joey Hunt. And James Campbell was an interesting rookie in OTAs to look at. He's in college, played at Montana State. He actually transitioned much like traditional, or not traditional, but Seahawks corners in the past. He was a receiver in college and then transitioned to cornerback recently. But therefore, I don't think he's that polished enough yet. And he doesn't have the exceptional athleticism to be able to get away with that. Much like a guy like Tariq Woolen last year, you're much more willing to take a chance on him because of that 4.2 speed at 6'4".
Yeah, I think that he's a player that might be worth monitoring in terms of bottom of the depth chart going up against guys like Isaiah Dunn. And a lot of this really depends. We expect that Tariq Woolen's going to be back for the start of training camp. But if somehow he's out a little bit longer than expected. Then a guy like Campbell maybe can get an opportunity to move up the pecking order. For me, my next three out, I've got Matt Landers, as you mentioned. I just think he's too much of a one-trick pony right now. He's a player that I'm hoping Seattle can develop on the practice squad. You can get a little more polish on his route running, and then he might be able to play in some games for them this next season. And Joey Blount, this one was tough for me because I think if Jamal Adams is healthy, that's a big if here coming off that injury that he suffered last year. But if you've got a healthy Jamal Adams, you've got Quandre Diggs, you just drafted Jarek Reed, you signed Julian Love, they've got John Radigan back on special teams. I think it's going to be really hard for a player like Joey Blount to make this football team, unfortunately, even though I like the player. And Tyler Mabry, he's another player that, unfortunately, he's playing at a position that's got Noah Fant, you've got Will Dissly, you've got Kobe Parkinson. I just can't see Seattle holding 4 tight ends, especially with Nick Bellore likely still be on this roster as the fullback. I just can't see it happening. So he is one of those next 3 out for me. We're going to get to our depth charts coming up next. We're going to start on the offensive side of the football and see where you and I were similar, where we differed on the offensive side of the football. We'll get to that here as we get our first 53-man roster projections underway here on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by FanDuel. Make a fast break to FanDuel during the NBA playoffs because right now, new customers can get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's $1,000 back in bonus bets. If your first bet doesn't win, just download a FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to points scored and three-pointers drained. I'm a huge fan of player prop parlays, and you can make bets on individual players to score 20 points, 15 points, or 10 points on the website. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same-game parlay. There's no better place to bet on all the playoff action than America's #1 sportsbook. So visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn and get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's FanDuel.com/LockedOn. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. You're listening to the Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined for today's episode by my co-host, Dallas Cooper. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. For our everydayers coming up on our Thursday episode, we've got Nick Lee and Rob Rang. The two of them will be chatting with a special guest who holds the Seahawks offseason in very high regard. Should be a fun episode. Make sure that you are tuning in and listening. Let's get back to our first 53-man roster projections of the offseason. We just went through our last 3 in, first 3 out, next 3 out. Now let's look at the actual depth charts here. And we'll start with the skill positions. We'll get to the line later. But Dallas, let's talk the skill positions on your 53. I think you and I would both agree at quarterback, running back, for the most part, receiver, tight end, those positions, it seems pretty cut and dry as long as you can avoid the injury bug, who's going to be on this team. But there may be a guy or two that has a chance to play onto this roster.
And you hit the nail on the head. And for me, that's Matt Landers. And this is going to be a bold statement, but I would not be surprised as early as middle of the season if Matt Landers overtakes Derek Young on the wide receiver depth chart. And that's not saying that Derek Young is not going to be played often enough or he's going to be off the roster, because I think he's going to be a weapon used much like Waldron used last year, sometimes even at fullback. You're just going to put him in those positions. He's a body. He's 6'2", 220. You can put him at a variety of positions, and Derek Young has a variety of skill set. However, Matt Landers as a pure wide receiver, as a pure outside receiver, I feel that Landers, there's no way that he doesn't make this roster if it's because of strictly talent. He played at Georgia, went to Arkansas, 4.3 speed at 6'4", threatened the deep ball. Body control is there, especially on the deep throws when you got to make the back shoulder throws, adjust late in the routes. He can do that. Yes, he struggles at separating underneath, but that's not the reason that he would make the roster. He's going to make the roster being able to further an element that DK Metcalf also brings, being able to just throw it deep and just scare the top off of defenses. And that's what he's going to bring. And imagine how much that would help a guy like Jackson Smith-Njigba, whose one flaw a lot of people would say would be the threatening of the deep speed. And I think that's going to work hand in hand with the Seahawks offense.
Yeah, Landers, as I mentioned, was one of my players, one of the 6 players that was on the cusp of making the roster, just because I am so intrigued by the athletic tools. And that might be one of those guys that can sneak onto the 53-man roster just because the Seahawks are scared they're not going to be able to get him on the practice squad. There are so many receivers, but there are not many guys that are 6'4" that can run in the 4.3s. So if he impresses in the preseason and gets his name out there, teams have taken notice, you may have a very difficult time slipping him onto your practice squad. So that is something to keep in mind. As I mentioned earlier, in my particular projection here, I actually had Cade Johnson having a better chance of making this team than Landers, just because I look at the team the way that it is consistent right now. You've got Metcalf and Young as your bigger bodied receivers, and then you've got your slots with athleticism and Smith and Jigba, Lockett, Eskridge. Johnson is more of that crafty slot, a little different style player, and he can play special teams. So I don't have him making this team, but I have him ahead of Landers because he is a more polished receiver at this point. If you're looking at upside, Landers is oozing with it, with that athleticism. What was a tougher decision for me here actually was the quarterback spot with the new rule that has been put in place, what I'm going to call the 49ers rule, or I guess you could call it the Brock Purdy rule, that teams can have a third quarterback that doesn't count towards the 46 active. They have to be on the 53-man. But that gives Holton Ahlers a chance to potentially play his way into the roster, because Seattle has usually only held 2 quarterbacks. But I think Pete Carroll and company might consider working a little bit differently, seeing what happened last year in that playoff game with Brock Purdy. You know, Seattle ends up in a position that Holton Ahlers is playing snaps in the regular season game as a rookie. Probably not a good situation anyway, but it's better to go that route than having to throw a position player in at quarterback. So that could change the dynamic for teams like the Seahawks. They've typically only held 2 quarterbacks. That being said, I don't have him making this roster, and it seems pretty cut and dry to me with the running back position. The 2 guys that have been added, Ken Walker III and DJ Dallas returning. Nick Bloor's special teams contributions, you can list him as a fullback. I don't know if he's going to play it, but it seems pretty cut and dry to me. And then offensive line, I would feel the same way too, although there is some wiggle room with this in terms of who's going to be starting, because you got a couple incoming rookies in the interior, and you got some free agent signings that you added as well.
Yes, the center spot is the one spot that everyone has been wondering what the Seahawks are going to do to better that spot. With the signing of Evan Brown in the offseason, draft Oluwatimi. Personally, I go with Evan Brown as a starter for week 1. Now, that's not saying that Oluwatimi does not have a shot to earn that spot during the course of the season. Although for me, in week 1, you go with the more experienced center. You go with someone who's played the position in the NFL prior. He's got multiple years under his belt, and you've just seen what NFL defenses look like. The speed of the game changes, and Evan Brown has been here before. He's new to Seattle, but he's been in the league before. And I think that's a huge advantage to Oluwatimi. And again, not saying that Oluwatimi is not NFL ready, because Oluwatimi, I mean, he won every award you could ask for out of an offensive lineman in college football. You really can't ask for much more out of that in terms of his accolades, but you go with the more experience in week 1. But if you had to tell me by week 6 that Oluwatimi took the starting spot, I would not be surprised either.
Yeah, we talked about this on yesterday's episode. Rob and I disagreed on this. Rob agreed with you. Rob thinks that Evan Brown should be starting the week 1 game against the Rams, and he mentioned Aaron Donald being a big reason for that. You don't want to throw a rookie into the fire. I disagreed with him because I just think Oluwatimi is going to be the better player of the 2, and it's going to be obvious in training camp. That's where I stand right now. And so in my projection, I've got Oluwatimi as the starter. Obviously, Evan Brown is going to be on this team. His ability to play guard as well. That would be my one caveat to this. It's not going to impact who makes the team, but if Brown's not going to win the center job, maybe he gets thrust into a 3-way competition for the right guard job because he started a bunch of games for the Lions last year. I have Phil Haynes starting that position and Anthony Bradford. He, to me, I feel the way about Bradford that you feel about Oluwatimi. I think that the chance of him starting at some point this year is pretty high. And it's not that I don't like Phil Haynes, because I've been pretty high on him and have been waiting for a chance for him to get extensive snaps. But he's on a 1-year deal. Bradford's a player they're very excited about, and he's looked good so far. We'll see what he looks like when the pads come out. That's really when we can evaluate. But That's really what it boils down to. It's not who's going to make the team. If there's some injuries, that changes things up, but you know who your tackles are going to be with Cross and Lucas. You know who the backups are going to be in Forsyth and Curhan. And Curhan can play guard too. So he can be in the mix there if you have somebody get banged up. But you've got Lewis, you've got Bradford, Haynes, and then center position Oluwatimi and Brown. It seems to me pretty cut and dry, unless there's a guy that falls through waivers or whatever that's available to Seattle that they like at one of those spots in August, then maybe they might add at the position group. But I feel like those linemen, those 9 that I mentioned, those are the guys that are going to have the best chance to make this football team. And I just can't see anybody else that's competing right now at any of those positions having a chance to somehow make the 53. It would take injuries, and hopefully we don't have to worry about that in training camp. But we know this is football, and unfortunately those things do happen on both sides of the ball. Let's shift gears now to the defensive side. And as I mentioned with offense, everything seemed pretty cut and dry. Get a lot of returning big names, a lot of returning key contributors. Defense is a much different story. You've got all these free agent signings. You've got all these draft picks. You've got a few injured players that are trying to work their way back. So there are a lot of moving parts here on the defensive side of the football. Let's start in the trenches with the defensive tackles, defensive ends, and the edge guys, the outside linebackers. How do you see these position groups shaking out for the Seahawks on their 53-man roster, Dallas?
I think the Seahawks, you obviously on one edge, you're going to have Uchenna Nwosu, who had a great season last year in his first season in Seattle, really showed out and made that contract that John Schneider signed him at really look at a tremendous value, because he was excellent. And he's one of those guys in contention for an extension coming soon. But the opposite edge, I think they went with Darrell Taylor last season and that at the starter, and it didn't work well because of the first and second down. He couldn't hold up to set the edge for run defense. Boye Mafe last year was probably one of, if not your best edge setter against the run. You bring him in year 2 now, developing his pass rush moves. For him, he has all the athleticism in the world, got the strength you want. It's about synchronizing his hands and feet with his pass rush moves. But if you're talking about a dominant edge setting ability, Boye Mafe has that. But that's where it comes into play. On first and second downs as a starter, Darrell Taylor wasn't able to hold up. Now you add in Boye Mafe and Uchenna Nwosu. Both sides of your edge are strong run defenders, and they both can set the edge really well. And specifically, I would have went with Derek Hall opposite of Nwosu. However, when watching Derek Hall's tape, one thing has been really clear the more I watch, he's left arm dominant. When he goes for his long arm, when he's shedding blocks, he loves to use his left arm. Even if he's rushing against right tackles and you're traditionally using a long arm with the right arm, he will turn his body to use the left arm. Therefore, I think you got to, in the NFL, you're going to want him to rush over left tackles and not have to turn his body the wrong way to use the opposite arm. And that's also the same side that Nwosu is strong at. So I think that's why you're going to have him as the backup. And potentially in a couple of years, maybe you put him in as a starter. But I think that's the way that the edge rotation is going to have to go.
Interesting observation. And I could see that being something where the Seahawks are really pressing that issue right now on the practice field. Can we try to get that habit out and make it that maybe there's some long arm moves used with the other arm so that we can play Derek Hall on the other side? And he's a guy that is going to do what you ask him to do. And so I think if that's something they emphasize, they can work on that and they can get it to where he can play on the other side. But I have him being a backup as well on my depth chart. And I think he's going to play a lot of snaps. I mean, you got to keep guys fresh. But Nwosu and Taylor are the two that I have starting. This is really a critical season for Darrell Taylor. As you mentioned, he really struggled against the run last year and found his groove in the second half when he was playing as a situational rusher. Maybe that's the ceiling for him. And if he's going to get you 10 sacks a year, you're okay with that kind of production. But I think they're going to give him every opportunity to win that job. If Mafe is able to take a big step forward rushing the passer to go with what we saw defending the run, then he's got a really good chance early in the season to take that job from Darrell Taylor. It'll be second straight year that Taylor has not been able to hold on to that starting job. But all of these guys are going to get their reps. And I think Tyreek Smith, he's a player, the 2 practices he was in training camp last year, he just jumped off the field in terms of the pass rushing ability, the power, the burst. He just moved so much better than I thought he was going to based on his combine testing. I just have a feeling that he is going to be a player that is going to find his way onto the field on defense if he can stay healthy. Obviously, that's the big caveat there. And in the middle, as I mentioned earlier in the show, Forrest Merrill is making this football team on this projection for me just because they don't have that big 330-plus pound nose. Maybe they're moving away from that, but I feel like the Seahawks are going to want to have at least one guy like that on their roster. And with Brian Monet on the PUP list to start the season and potentially out for a big chunk of 2023, Merrill is the guy that benefits from that. I also think Jonah Tavai, with his situational nose tackle usage as a guy that can rush the passer, extremely disruptive. He is another one that I think the Seahawks will have a hard time slipping to the practice squad if he plays well like I think he's going to in the preseason. So you keep him on the roster with Forrest Merrill. You get Brian Monet back. Merrill might be the odd man out, but I think Tavai is a guy the organization is really excited about. And Jaron Reed can play nose too if needed. So they have some flexibility there along the defensive line. I like their 3-tech, 4-eye situation. The nose, there's a lot of uncertainty. The edge, can you get a little more consistency from that group? But you've used a lot of high draft picks. There's a lot to like. There's question marks in the back seven for the Seahawks as well, even though they've added some linebackers, a familiar name in Bobby Wagner. They've got a really nice corner group. We know that there are some guys coming off severe injuries. That always impacts these 53-man roster projections.
It always does. And Adams, especially, is the big name this offseason in the back end. And also Woolen just had an injury, although his is minor. They're expecting him to be back very soon. But Adams, that's a serious injury, as you said. But I think it speaks to how much the coaching staff has really fallen in love with Jarek Reed, that both of us, Corbin, are comfortable putting him as a backup safety. And also the signing of Julian Love is a great insurance policy, as being a former starter with the Giants. Brings positional versatility if you need him at nickel corner, if you need him at strong safety, free safety, in the box, single high. He's done it all. And that's what you need out of these depth pieces. And that's exactly what you want. Trey Brown is actually a name I'm very interested in seeing this offseason, as he had an extremely promising rookie year that was sidetracked due to a really nasty knee injury. And he's been recovering. And then last year, he didn't get the opportunity to come back because he was still working back with the knee injury. But this offseason is going to be huge. Can he push to really be a second string corner and really be even pushed to even get some minutes out there? Maybe he even switches over to a slot corner to try to get some playing time. You never know. But Trey Brown is a name that is extremely intriguing for me to watch this offseason.
Especially with Woolen not getting the reps now during OTAs. And again, I talked about this yesterday. I don't think that's a huge deal for him. You'd obviously like to get him more work because he's still a raw player. It's hard to believe that with what he did last year. But still, this is a chance for Trey Brown. He may benefit as much as anybody because he's having a normal offseason. He didn't get that last year. He missed the first half of the year just trying to get his way back onto the field. And so being able to get all those reps that he missed last spring, that gives him a chance, especially if they give him some reps in the slot where maybe he can get some snaps on defense and sub packages. And maybe he ends up getting some reps at right corner, plays well. Who knows what's going to end up happening on that front. But when Woolen and Witherspoon are healthy, or they're there, you're expecting that those guys are going to be your starters. The one thing that we agree on, we had the opportunity to put players on injured reserve or PUP for this projection. We both agreed that Brian Monet is not going to be ready for week 1, but we also agree that Jamal Adams and Jordan Brooks both will be ready. Now, Adams is the one that was a little more murky to me just because a torn quad tendon, that is a really unique injury that doesn't happen often in the NFL, and it's a nasty one. Who knows where he's going to be at in his rehab, but everything that I've heard sounds like they are optimistic that training camp at some point, he's going to be back in the field and he'll be ready for week 1. Jordan Brooks, he's trending towards potentially being available at the beginning of training camp, which I can't believe with how late that torn ACL happened last year, but everything that I'm hearing on that front, he's ahead of schedule. This guy is one of those quick healers. He's a warrior. He's a young guy. So I think both those players are going to be available for the Seahawks in training camp. They're not going to have to be on the PUP list. And so if one of those guys ends up going that route, then there's an extra roster spot that's open for the first 4 weeks of the season minimum. That's not available in this projection, though, with those two guys being healthy and counting against that 53-man roster. So guys like Vi Jones or Joey Blunt that might have been on the cusp of making this football team are on the outside looking in. The Seahawks are hoping to bring them back as practice squad players. But overall, if you can have a healthy Jamal Adams, healthy Jordan Brooks, Devin Bush joining the fold, there's a lot of really fascinating parts here in this back seven. It's really going to boil down to where health is at. If you're missing Brooks and or Adams early in the season, have they added enough to be able to compensate for that with Bush and Love being signed as insurance policies? I think those are good players to have in that case, especially Love with his ability to play in the slot. But they've set themselves up to have much more favorable depth, especially when all those guys are healthy, than what they did last year. And I think there's more upside on the defensive line, though. That big nose tackle position with the losses they've had there, that is really the boom or bust position right now, where you're going to be relying on a lot of rookies. And a guy like, Forrest Merrill's played in a couple regular season games, and he is the elder statesman of that group right now with Brian Monet not being healthy. So that is still the one everybody's circling with some concern. Are you going to get the production out of the rookies that you're hoping you can? Is there a veteran you can get off the waiver wire in August? I mean, there's some moving parts there still, but it seems like they are in a better position on defense if they can get everything to come together and they can avoid the injury bug that's really bogged them down the last couple of years. We'll have a chance after OTAs wrap up to revisit these projections and see where things stand. But for now, I'm feeling pretty good about where things are at. And I know that Dallas is really excited about his roster as well. As always, you can follow me on Twitter at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Dallas at Dallas C. Cooper. Subscribe and follow Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. Coming up tomorrow, Rob Rang, Nick Lee. On our Thursday episode, we'll be bringing in a special guest to break down the Seahawks offseason. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for listening in. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Go Hawks.